Our next speaker today is Robert Cohen. Robert is one of the leading Jewish dissident voices here in the UK. He works closely with Jews for Justice for Palestinians and has written widely on the subject, notably on his blog, Micah's Paradigm Shift. In a post last year to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, he wrote an imaginary letter to Anne Frank, and he posed a few questions with which he was wrestling. And so he asked, what happens when your death and all of those you have come to represent becomes abused by your own people and used to justify the blotting out of another people, their identity, their history, and their heritage? As a writer committed to the search for justice, kindness, and humility, I imagine that this is a question with which you are continuing to wrestle. Robert, it's a delight to have you with us today, and we look forward to what you have to share with us. Robert Cohen.
Thank you very much. We've all had a wonderful lunch, and I'm feeling very full. And you're allowed to kind of nod off if you want to, but I'm going to have to kind of stay awake somehow. And anyway, Nick, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. I feel as if I perhaps owe you a little bit more of an introduction. As Nick said, the publicity for today describes me as one of the leading Jewish dissident voices on Israel-Palestine in Britain, but I have to own up. It's really not that difficult to be one of the leading dissident voices on Israel-Palestine in Britain. It's a very small field. So just to be clear, you are not hearing from a mainstream Jewish voice. I am not typical. I am not representative. I am decidedly marginal, which is why I call the monthly blog at the Pathos website that I now write, Writing from the Edge. The Board of Deputies is not keen on me. In fact, I've been discovering in the last week just how not keen on me they are. The Chief Rabbi is not a fan. I've spoken to many Christian gatherings around the country, and I thank you for having me in Cheltenham today, but I'm yet to receive a single invitation from a Jewish organisation to speak. And I think that tells you something about the limits of acceptable discourse on Israel within the Jewish community today. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later. My original blog, as Nick was saying, was called Micah's Paradigm Shift, which gives you another hint as to where I'm coming from on all of this. I know lots of you, probably all of you actually, will be familiar with the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament. Micah, Amos, Jeremiah, and of course the big fella, Isaiah. They began a very long tradition of internal Jewish dissent, a tradition of speaking truth to power and calling for justice and righteousness without fear of the consequences. Jesus was certainly part of that Jewish tradition as well. You could say that the prophets of the Hebrew Bible were the original self-hating Jews. That's not my description of them, though. What's brilliant about Judaism is that we kept the prophets within the scriptural canon. We didn't edit them out, and now it's far too late. Thankfully, we are stuck with them. Now, that's very good news for me around the world who now realise that speaking truth to power once again means speaking up against our own Jewish leadership and to the government of the Jewish state of Israel. My own take on Judaism and my attempt to find meaning in the many tragedies of the Jewish people and through Jewish history is shaped by that prophetic tradition. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that what's the point of being Jewish? What's the point of being alive to the message of Jewish history if you don't apply that distinctive Jewish voice for justice. Without what I like to call that Jewish edginess, why be Jewish at all? Now, I do find myself having to say more and more what I am not. So here goes. I am not anti-Semitic. I am not a self-hating Jew, unless you think that Isaiah was as well. I don't want the destruction of Israel or a second Holocaust or the Jews of Israel pushed into the sea. Nor do I believe that anything that I would say would lead to such outcomes. So what do I believe? I believe that anti-Semitism exists. It's real. It always will be. But certainly in Britain there's a lot less of it than certain people want you to believe. I believe Jewish people do have a right to self-determination. I believe there is a profound connection between Jews and the land of Israel. But I'm not a Zionist, even of the moderate liberal variety. And sadly, not being Zionist puts you beyond the pale as far as most of the Jewish community is concerned. Most importantly, I believe that our relationship to the Palestinian people is the defining relationship for Jews and Judaism in the 21st century. Right now, and for some considerable time, we've been making a terrible hash of that relationship. And if we don't talk honestly about this subject, why should anyone listen to Jewish voices on any other ethical issue of our age? I hope that helps you to understand where I'm coming from and what I'm trying to say to you in the next few minutes. And it's a great pity that I can't fit all of that on my business card. Let's get back to the theme of today. Since last November, I've been speaking to groups around the country about the Balfour Declaration, which, as we've been hearing, was issued by the British government 100 years ago this November. And the thing about Balfour is that it's still not history, is it? It's current affairs. The consequences of Balfour are still being played out today, and nobody can tell you how it's going to end. Apparently, Donald Trump is keen to make a deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We've been hearing about that all year, but nobody knows exactly what it looks like. Trust me, he seems to say, I'm in real estate. But if he thinks it's just about real estate, then he has a great deal to learn. This week, Trump has been at the United Nations in New York, and there he met the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Donald was certainly talking up the prospects for peace. I really think we have a chance, he said. I think Israel would like to see it, and I think the Palestinians would like to see it, and I can tell you that the Trump administration would like to see it. Personally, I find it very hard to believe that a man who's managed to bring such division and conflict to his own country is going to be just the person to bring peace to the Middle East. The other thing that makes me sceptical about the current political dynamics is Benjamin Netanyahu's love affair with the American president. On Monday, Netanyahu said to Trump, "Mr. President, it's great to see you again. I want to say that under your leadership, the alliance between America and Israel has never been stronger, never been deeper. I can say this in ways that people see and in ways that they don't. So I want to thank you for that." In his speech at the UN on Tuesday, Netanyahu reminded the General Assembly about President Trump's visit to Israel in May and how the president had stood at the Western Wall. And Bibi told his audience, "When the president touched those ancient stones, he touched our hearts forever." That's touching, isn't it? Right. If America really thinks that it can be the honest broker for peace, it needs to break off the romance. It needs to be a little less emotionally involved. It needs to create some creative and diplomatic distance between itself and Israel. The more Bibi fawns over Donald and the more Donald praises Israel, the less likely peace and justice becomes. And I think that's certainly the experience of the last 25 years. Far too many carrots are a very poor diet for peace. Interestingly, Netanyahu was also invoking the Hebrew prophets this week, in particular Isaiah. Israel, he said, was a light unto the nations, and he claimed to the assembly, as he reeled off Israel's impressive exports. He was talking about cutting-edge technology in agriculture, in water, in cyber security, in medicine, in autonomous vehicles, you name it, he said, we've got it. And, of course, there's one more thing that he also added to that list: exceptional capabilities in fighting terrorism, by which he meant, of course, the battle-tested hardware and software that has enabled the pacification of the Palestinian people over the past 50 years in their own land, in Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem. All of this explains how the Israeli Prime Minister has been such a popular travelling salesman around the world this year, and why world leaders are keen to visit Israel, most notably, apart from Donald Trump, Prime Minister Modi of India, who's also been to the country this year. However, I'm not quite convinced that arms sales and surveillance equipment is what Isaiah had in mind when he talked about us being a light unto the nations. I thought the aim was to turn the swords into ploughshares, not to sell more swords. But you can see how those in power and with power want to co-opt the greatest critics of earthly power for their own causes. And I can now feel a book coming on, the uses and abuses of the prophetic tradition. I don't think I should write it. I reckon there's people out there that are actually better equipped than I am to write that book. Theresa May. I think she saw the Prime Minister, didn't she, when we started this morning? Yeah. Theresa May wants to make deals too. She met Benjamin Netanyahu in Downing Street in February. And I think Mrs May did mumble something about settlements being obstacles to peace before she and the Prime Minister got down to the real business of the meeting, which was, of course, business, trade. Because we in Britain now need all of the trading friends that we can make, because we're about to dump the ones that we used to have. Okay, more on Mrs May a little bit later. But I think everything that we are seeing today, whether it's in London or New York or Ramallah or Jerusalem or Gaza, can be traced back to the Balfour Declaration in 1917. Now, when I've been talking about Balfour, I've been dedicating my talk to the wrong kind of Jews, by which I mean the awkward Jews, the dissenting Jews, the troublemaking Jews, the ones who stubbornly and annoyingly for some get in the way of things and generally disrupt the official approved Jewish leadership narrative. I'm talking about Jews like me and others like Jeff Halper and Ilan Pape and Mark Ellis and Mark Braverman. I hope you've heard of some of those names. Now, being the wrong kind of Jew can be a thankless job, but as I hope you'll see, you can still play an influential part in history. Now, when I tell organisers that the talk that I want to give is called The Wrong Kind of Jews, they get a little bit nervous. And I have to say, even the brilliant organising team here got a little bit twitchy when we were talking about the name of the talk. And it's very understandable. They're already anticipating that phone call from the Board of Deputies accusing them of giving a platform for anti-Semitism. So I have to reassure people about the title and explain that it isn't a phrase that I've made up. I borrowed it from Chaim Weizmann, a man who knew all about Jewish troublemakers. I know you've all heard of Arthur Balfour. You definitely need to know the name Chaim Weizmann as well, and you'd have seen him talked about in the film that we saw this morning. In terms of the Declaration in 1917, you really can't have one without the other. Actually, in November, we ought to be marking not the Balfour Declaration, but the Balfour-Weizmann Declaration. Otherwise, it's a bit like remembering Rodgers without Hammerstein or Elton John without Bernie Taupin. You don't get the full show or the full song. Weizmann, the future president of the State of Israel, met Arthur Balfour, the former Conservative Prime Minister and future First World War Foreign Secretary, for the first time at a Manchester hotel more than 10 years before the Balfour Declaration. Now, Weizmann describes their encounter in his autobiography called Trial and Error that was published in 1949. As their first meeting ended, Balfour said to Weizmann, "It's curious. The Jews I meet are quite different from you." Weizmann paused for a moment, for effect, and then answered, "Mr. Balfour, you meet the wrong kind of Jews. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the wrong kind of Jews 100 years ago and since, in the hope of showing you that there has always been significant Jewish dissent around Zionism and the actions of the State of Israel. And I believe the attitude of the wrong kind of Jews can give us some guidance as to how we should commemorate the centenary of the Declaration this year, and also what advice we could give to Theresa May and her Foreign Secretary. But let's just start by reminding ourselves what the Declaration says. It's just, thank you. It's just 67 words. You're getting very familiar with this by now. I reckon you'll have memorised it by the end of the afternoon. I'm going to read it to you one more time. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country." Okay, 67 deliberately vague words that get blamed for a great deal of trouble, and rightly so. But before we get too enraged, let me acknowledge that Balfour is a very impressive document. What's impressive is that there's so much going on in so few words. It's even richer in cultural and historical resonance than President Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which, by the way, is 272 words long. I've counted. So you really are getting diplomatic value for money with the Balfour Declaration. Now, you can only understand what's going on in Balfour by studying British imperialism, the international power politics of the First World War, misconceptions about the influence of the Jewish community in Russia and the United States at that time, the history of Western European colonialism, 2,000 years of Christian-Jewish relations, 19th century Christian Zionism, Enlightenment ideas about human rights, and the divisions within the Jewish community over the best response to centuries of European anti-Semitism. 67 words. Luckily, you've still got about 6 weeks to get stuck into all of this and do all the necessary background reading. If you don't have time, I'd recommend Warren's book, Consequences. Still got copies available, I think? Yeah, there's a few. It's a good book. I recommend it. Thank you. A well-known summation of the Balfour Declaration was made some years later by the Jewish writer Arthur Koestler. And if you have a look on the slide there, Koestler said, and Fadi mentioned this in his talk as well this morning, Balfour was a document in which one nation solemnly promises to a second nation the country of a third nation. So it's kind of, it's quite pithy and memorable, that summary, but it does actually have its own failings. For a start, could you, in 1917, call the Jewish people a nation in any meaningful sense relating to modern nation-states? As we'll see, many Jews in 1917 said, no, you can't, and you shouldn't even try. The Palestinian position in 1917 was also more complex than Koestler's soundbite. They weren't a nation-state either. They were subjects of the Ottoman Empire. but they did have the moral advantage of being the majority on the land for 1,000 years or more, and they had the title deeds of ownership. Not that any of that stood for much once Britain had made up its imperial mind. Nor does it count for much today among Christian and Jewish religious Zionists who look to the Bible to provide the ultimate in estate agent documentation, which pulls rank on all other paperwork. So how should we commemorate the Balfour Declaration? Is there anything to celebrate, or is it just a dark moment in British imperial history that many are still paying the price for? Finally, I want to just tell you a bit more about, Firstly, I want to tell you a bit more about the talented, charming and skillful diplomat, Chaim Weizmann. In the years leading up to the Balfour Declaration, the Russian-born research chemist was teaching at Manchester University, at the same time as becoming the leading figure of the still small Zionist movement in Britain. Now, it was Weizmann who led the negotiations with the British government, and it was Weizmann who succeeded where Theodor Herzl, the father of political Zionism, had failed. Weizmann got an empire, in fact the global superpower of the day, to back the radical project of Jewish nationalism. It was Weizmann rather than Herzl that shifted Zionism onto an entirely new level. And there's no doubt that the Balfour Declaration was the point when Zionism became supercharged. It was no longer just a dream or a theory or just an ideology. It was now an achievable project for which a programme of action could be mapped out. And Weizmann, over the following years, set about doing just that. By the way, if you think the Balfour Declaration is terrible, you should have seen the first draft. Okay? The first draft was not written by the Foreign Office. It was written by the leadership of the Zionist organisation in Britain, and it was sent to the Foreign Office in the summer of 1917. And if that version had gone through unchallenged, history would have been very different. The first version, that first draft, made no reference whatsoever to anyone else living in the land and proposed a British protection for Zionist colonialism without interference while a Jewish state-building apparatus was put in place. So the Balfour Declaration wording by November was actually considerably watered down, in part due to the wrong kind of Jews that Weizmann blamed in his autobiography for making life more difficult for him. But Jews like Weizmann believed absolutely in the righteousness of Zionism, as do most Jewish people today. Weizmann firmly believed that he was embarked on a project that was utterly essential for the Jewish people, and that it was high-minded and it was just. And I know there are some people who want to say that Zionism is just an expression of racism. But if that's all you see, then you're failing to understand its historical and political context and the very real dilemmas faced by Jews living in both Western and Eastern Europe by the late 19th century. For Weizmann and for others, Zionism also meant far more than finding the Jewish people a safe home free from anti-Semitism. Zionism for Weizmann was not merely primitive tribalism, as he believed his Jewish and anti-Zionist opponents imagined it to be. Jewish homelessness and anti-Semitism was not just a physical discomfort for Weizmann. Zionism was much more nobler. In his autobiography, he writes about Zionism's inner significance and its constructive, moral, ethical, social character for Jews as individuals and as a nation. So this is Zionism as a psychological as much as a physical and territorial issue. Now, Weizmann first came to the attention of the British government through his laboratory work at Manchester University. He'd been working on a way to produce acetone through a fermentation process that used carbohydrates like starch and glucose. So time for a very brief chemistry lesson. Okay? You're going to have to really concentrate now. All right. Just stick with me for a minute. Okay, acetone was important because it could be used to make cordite. Okay, you're taking notes, aren't you? Okay, cordite is what's called a low explosive. It's like gunpowder. okay, and it can be used to propel a bullet or a shell to its target without destroying the barrel. So if you could work out how to mass produce acetone, you could be of great service to the British war effort. Now, Weizmann was at plans to say that the Balfour Declaration was in no way a gift to him from a grateful nation at war, and I would agree that that would be far too simple a way of telling the story. But in my mind, there is at least a metaphorical link between Weizmann's chemistry and his Zionism. After all, what is Zionism if not a process of mixing elements together to create a propellant with explosive potential? Okay, are you following me? Okay, welcome to my laboratory of the mind. Take a pinch of Judaism, a dose of anti-Semitism and a dollop of European nationalism, a colonial view of the goodness of Western civilization, a sprinkling of communal psychology, and start a fermentation process. And out of the other end comes Zionism. Okay, and it's a pretty potent concoction. Now, Britain's current chief rabbi would certainly object to my chemistry lesson. But if I'm a poor chemist, then Ephraim Mervis is surely a worse historian. I'll come back to Rabbi Mervis in a moment. These days, when you talk about Zionism in pro-Israel circles, you're not allowed to use language like colonialism, or worse still, settler colonialism. Writing in The Guardian recently, the novelist Howard Jacobson said, Zionism took many forms, but neither conquest nor colonial expansionism was one of them. So there's another Jewish commentator on Israel with a shaky grasp of history, and indeed Zionism itself. 100 years ago, Zionist leaders like Chaim Weizmann had no problem articulating their ideas in terms of colonialism and settlements and bringing civilization to the east. They weren't embarrassed or queasy about this kind of language because it was so embedded in the Western European outlook on the east. But how typical was Weizmann's Zionism within the British Jewish community 100 years ago? Did his view of the Jews as a nation in desperate need of a national home reflect a Jewish consensus? Interestingly, at the War Cabinet meeting during which the declaration was approved on the 31st of October 1917, Balfour told his fellow cabinet members that the vast majority of Jews in Russia and America, as indeed all over the world, now appeared to be favourable to Zionism. Well, to use a modern phrase, that was fake news. This is the aspect of the 100th anniversary of Balfour that comes as a surprise to many people. Jews, wherever you found them in 1917, were, on the whole, not Zionist. When you listen to the discourse around Israel and Zionism today, and what does and does not constitute Jewish identity and anti-Semitism, it's almost the exact opposite of the debate 100 years ago. Now, this is critical to understand if you want to challenge today's rigid definitions of what being Jewish means or what caring about Judaism means or what the definition of anti-Semitism should be. Weizmann spends a great many pages in Trial and Error describing not Arab but Jewish opposition to Zionism, the wrong kind of Jews. Opposition was articulated mostly from the well-established, well-off Jews of West London, but the impoverished Jews of Whitechapel were hardly Zionist advocates either, not in 1917. And unlike today, you could travel along almost the entire religious Jewish spectrum without meeting a Zionist. There were many competing ideas as to how to respond to being Jewish and combating anti-Semitism in the early years of the 20th century. In the Jewish East End of London, you would have found Jewish communists and Jewish socialists and Jewish anarchists. And within this immigrant political cauldron, you would have found Zionism too. But you would not have put your money on that particular ism being the one that would triumph. Actually, I don't think it ever did triumph in Britain, not really. What won the day for British Jews was not communism, socialism or Zionism, but a different ism, aspirationism. A better job, a nicer house, family security, the respect of your neighbours, the same kind of aspirations expressed by poor and oppressed people all over the world. The thinking of many East End Jews 100 years ago would have gone something like this: why leave Whitechapel to go to Palestine when if we work hard we can get a semi with a small garden in Ilford or even Finchley? Isn't that perfectly good Jewish ambition? Isn't that Jewish self-determination? Oh, and by the way, Mr. Weitzman, my moral, social and ethical character is fine, thanks very much, and I'll see you in synagogue on Saturday morning. Hard to believe in 2017, but in 1917 it was perfectly acceptable to be non or even anti-Zionist without anyone calling you a self-hating Jew, and of being accused of being out of line with thousands of years of Jewish teaching. In fact, the opposite idea, that Zionism was just the flip side to anti-Semitism, had far greater currency within the Jewish community. After all, the Zionists were insisting that Jews had no place and no real future among the nations of the world. Now, even though it came from a very different direction, that view chimed with a great deal of anti-Semitism. Okay, time to introduce you to some of Weitzman's wrong kind of Jews, the ones that helped influence the final draft of the Balfour Declaration. David Alexander was president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews between 1903 and 1917. He also served as vice president of the Anglo-Jewish Association, and he was president of the Jewish Working Men's Club and served on various other notable Jewish institutions of the day. So it was about as establishment as you could possibly get. On the 24th of May 1917, Alexander was a co-signatory to a letter to the Times, along with other Jews, in which they set out their grave objections to the Zionist ambitions. The letter rejected what they saw as the conflation of nationality and religion. And here's what they wrote. Zionist theory regards all Jewish communities of the world as constituting one homeless nationality incapable of complete social and political identification with the nations among whom they dwell. Against this theory, we strongly and earnestly protest. The letter goes on to recognise, in hindsight, a painfully accurate prediction that Zionists would give Jewish settlers in Palestine special rights in excess of those enjoyed by the rest of the population. Meanwhile, Orthodox Judaism viewed the whole Zionist project as usurping the hand of God, attempting to hasten the arrival of the Jewish Messiah. For Judaism, exile had always been understood in religious and spiritual contexts. It was not merely a physical dislocation from ancestral land. There was much more to it. Our behaviour had put us in exile from God, and we had to work our way back into his favour through prayer, study, and good deeds. God would decide when the exile was over, not us. That's why in 1800 years there had not been an organised mass movement to return to the Promised Land. And it's why Zionism needs to be seen as a radical departure from Jewish thinking up to the 19th century, and not a natural development of prayer book liturgy. Meanwhile, on the non-Orthodox progressive end of Judaism was the voice of Claude Montefiore, the leader of the liberal Jewish denomination in Britain and also a founder and co-president of the Anglo-Jewish Association. Again, not a marginal figure. Montefiore observed, "Is it not to begin with a suspicious fact that those who have no love for the Jews and those who are pronounced anti-Semites all seem to welcome the Zionist proposals and aspirations?" Now, that particular quote could have been written to describe some of President Trump's close associates in the White House, or at least until recently, and indeed many of his supporters, particularly his grassroots support among white supremacists. It also works for some of the unpleasant far-right political leaders in Eastern Europe today, and it's proof that you can be pro-Zionist and anti-Semitic simultaneously. Meanwhile, in Lloyd George's wartime cabinet was Edwin Montagu, a Jew who strongly opposed Zionism, which he called a mischievous political creed untenable by any patriotic citizen of the United Kingdom. Imagine any member of today's cabinet coming out with that, let alone a Jewish member of the cabinet. Montagu thought that Zionism was anti-Semitic, and he succeeded in modifying the language of the final draft of the Declaration to make sure it did not disenfranchise Jews living anywhere else in the world apart from Palestine. In a memo to the cabinet, he set out his objections. I assume that it means that Mohammedans, which he meant Muslims, and Christians are to make way for the Jews, and that the Jews should be put in all positions of preference and should be particularly associated with Palestine in the same way that England is with the English and France with the French, and that Turks and Mohammedans in Palestine will be regarded as foreigners, just in the same way as Jews will be hereafter be treated as foreigners in every country but Palestine. Montagu really understood where this project was heading. Now, contrast all of this Jewish ambivalence towards Zionism 100 years ago with where we are today, and the evidence given by our Jewish leadership in the UK to the Home Affairs Select Committee in its report into anti-Semitism published last October. Okay, back to my friend Ephraim Mervis. The chief rabbi told the committee, Zionism has been an integral part of Judaism from the dawn of our faith. Okay, I'm just going to read you that again. Okay. Zionism has been an integral part of Judaism from the dawn of our faith. Okay, I told you he was a terrible historian. Okay. In the spring of 2016, the day before local elections here and some by-elections and some city mayor elections, Rabbi Mervis wrote in the Daily Telegraph that Zionism was a noble and integral part of Judaism. In fact, one of the axioms of Jewish belief, and that one can no more separate Zionism from Judaism than separate the City of London from Great Britain. Okay, meanwhile, Sir Mick Davis, who was then chairman of the Jewish Leadership Council, he told that same parliamentary committee that criticising Zionism is the same as anti-Semitism because Zionism is so totally identified with how the Jew thinks of himself and is so associated with the right of the Jewish people to have their own country and to have self-determination within that country, that if you attack Zionism, you attack the very fundamentals of how the Jews believe in themselves. And I would have to agree with Sir Mick's assessment, and reliable research into Jewish attitudes in Britain certainly backs him up. You can see some of those stats on that slide. But how has this happened? How have the criticisms of Alexander and Montefiore and Montagu been so easily forgotten? What we've seen over the last few generations is a deliberate muddling of the scriptural biblical use of the word Zion and the modern political project of Jewish nationalism called Zionism. So much so that political Zionism and Judaism have undergone a seamless merger. We have successfully muddled a religious and historical connection to the promised land of our scripture with a nationalist project of colonialism. We can no longer tell the difference between the two, and we've used one to justify the other. It begs a bigger political and philosophical question about whether a belief held by the majority within one particular group means it becomes sacrosanct, holy, and therefore untouchable. But what happens to that sacrosanct understanding of being Jewish when another people have experienced that same sanctification as a catastrophe? The Balfour Declaration marked the beginning of this journey towards a new Jewish identity. You can't begin to understand that seamless merger without understanding something about the Jewish Holocaust and the ongoing trauma that it's created in Jewish life and outlook. The sense of Jewish abandonment by the world during the 1930s and 1940s remains strong 70 years later, while the arguments for depending on welcoming, tolerant, multicultural democracies can feel weak and naive. Even if you like where we are, at the back of our minds is the idea that if the going gets tough, there's somewhere to go that won't close its doors in our face. Looking at 20th century history, it's a very understandable conclusion. Added to this is the what-if school of history. What if there had been a Jewish state in 1933 or by 1940? How many millions of Jews would have been rescued? It's all very powerful and compelling rhetoric. And if you challenge the iron logic of eternal victimhood and national salvation, you're again trampling on sanctified ground. But I don't buy into any of this anymore. I believe it's poor historical understanding. I think it's poor politics, and it's very bad for your mental well-being as well. Ultimately, narrow ethno-religious nationalism doesn't bring you safety. The history of the State of Israel has proved it. And there are different lessons I think I would draw from the Holocaust too. But where does this new post-war Jewish identity leave dissenting, non-Zionist British Jews like me who think that Edward Montague and Claude Montefiore not only understood the full implications of Zionism better than the Zionists themselves, but that they also predicted its consequences? Balfour led directly to the establishment of the Jewish state, and the creation of that state dispossessed another people. How else could such a project of return on the scale of millions and with a priority of national self-determination based on majority rule have been achieved in any other way? This was always going to happen. However noble and high-minded Zionism was in its desire to lift Jews out of oppression, this was always going to turn out badly for another people. Because the fundamental problem with the project was that, as we were hearing this morning, Palestine was not, as the Zionist slogan put it, a land without a people for a people without a land. And in truth, it didn't take the early Zionist pioneers settling in Palestine very long to understand this. For the Jewish people, it's been a story of return and renewal, and of literally rising from our ashes. But if it's you that's being dispossessed, then you're not going to see or experience Zionism in quite the same way. Now, for a long time, I used to think that the whole problem was about competing narratives and opposing nationalisms. I was what's called a liberal Zionist. I was critical of the occupation and the settlements, but fundamentally I was in support of Zionism. But after years of reading and listening, and eventually having the opportunities to talk to Palestinians in the West Bank, I changed my mind. It's true the problem is complex and the history is long, but I actually think it's simpler than people want you to think it is. Israel-Palestine is, thankfully, not a religious conflict, although sometimes I think Benjamin Netanyahu sounds keen to turn it into one by branding all Palestinian attacks as ISIS-inspired anti-Jewish hatred. Some Christians also want to turn it into a religious conflict. A mailing I received over the summer from the UK branch of Christians United for Israel. You have to realise I just get myself on these mailing lists so I know what they're talking about, not because I am supporting them in any way. Anyway, the mailing that came in the post over the summer informing that the violence over the Temple Mount that Mustafa was talking to us about this morning, this is how Christians United for Israel described what was happening that week. It was, they said, a spiritual battle between good and evil, a conflict which has been going on for millennia. Now, if it really does become a religious conflict, I think we're probably all doomed. Today, I don't think it's a nationalist conflict either. I think that ended effectively in 1948. It's certainly not a conflict between equals. It's not half a dozen of one and six of the other. It's not a plague on all your houses. And it's not a case of, if only they could sit down and get to know each other better and sing songs and build bridges, then everything would be fine. Okay? So what is it all about? 100 years after Balfour, I think it boils down to this. Back one, that's it. Who has rights and who does not? Who takes those rights away and who protests and resists? Who is treated well and who is treated badly? Who has power and who does not? And then, to check that you've not misread the situation, count the house demolitions, count the homeless, count the children arrested in the middle of the night, count those in Israeli prisons detained indefinitely without charge, count the orphaned, count the maimed, and count the dead. And then decide which side should feel most afraid and least secure. In every other part of the world, calling for human rights and equal rights is a pretty uncontroversial thing to say. But when it comes to Israel, such talk is disloyal and heretical if you are Jewish, and if you're not Jewish, then you are accused of promoting the destruction and genocide of the Jewish people. It's certainly a very odd state of affairs, one where the victims of an occupation and an annexation and a siege are consistently represented as the aggressors and terrorists, and where all forms of resistance, whether violent or non-violent, are considered equally illegitimate. The British government makes no serious attempt to challenge this way of looking at the situation, and our Jewish leadership in Britain choose to focus on examples of Palestinian incitement and hatred of Jews without the slightest attempt at historical or political context. They just hate us. That's about as sophisticated as the analysis gets. As a result, they constantly represent the symptoms as if they are the causes. Some things are certain, though. There is no going back to a time before Balfour. There is no pre-Zionist Palestine that we can now return to. Jews and Arabs will both be part of the future landscape. But for everyone to move on, I think we Jews have to let go. 100 years after Balfour, it's time to let go of Zionism and see it as it is, a false messiah, another golden calf, a moral cul-de-sac, an aberration in our history, not a continuum. We need to unpick the tangle of Jewish identity that we've arrived at, which is currently reinforced by a Jewish leadership that fails to see where it has led us. What about Theresa May? He's still hanging on in there. When it comes to the Balfour Declaration, Theresa May set out her position in a speech to the Conservative Friends of Israel last December. And she said that the UK was entering a special time and described the declaration as an anniversary we will mark with pride. There'll certainly be no apology. The Foreign Office has already responded to that demand with this announcement. I'll just quote from it. The Balfour Declaration is an historic statement for which Her Majesty's government does not intend to apologise. A full assessment of the declaration and what followed from it can only be made by historians. But as I said, it's not history. It's still current affairs, and that's the problem. So where are today's wrong kind of Jews, and what's their advice on how to respond to this centenary of the Balfour Declaration? In Britain, we have a very small Jewish community, about 360,000 people. That's about half of 1% of the population. That means it's very difficult to build a critical mass of internal Jewish opposition to the standard party line on Israel. So it can feel like a very lonely place to be when even mild-mannered, polite Jews like me get branded as rabid radicals for talking about equal rights. In America, it's a different story. There you are seeing a generational fracturing of attitudes towards Israel. It's very interesting what's going on. Younger Jews raised on liberal American values and a Jewish ethic of compassion and the value of equal rights have run out of patience with Israel and are beginning to build an active movement of protest. The question is whether they stay within their communities and in time become the new leadership, or if they opt out of formal Jewish life altogether because of this issue. So what to do? The wrong kind of Jews need to form new friendships and new alliances. We need to make common cause with like-minded people. First and foremost, with the Palestinians themselves, but also other groups who suffer prejudice and discrimination. To borrow from Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, none of us will be truly free until all of us are free. The wrong kind of Jews need to support churches and mosques who are willing to challenge Jewish interfaith dialogue when it becomes a collusion of silence over Israel. It means supporting the work of Sabeel Kairos UK in its work to promote responsible investment by churches across the country so that they are not inadvertently funding and propping up the occupation. We need to call out real anti-Semitism when we see it in the left or the right, but protest when criticism of Israel is used to close down legitimate debate or, worse still, undermine an entire political party. And this November, it's about making sure that the Balfour Declaration does not continue to make Palestinians invisible. That means talking about the purpose of the Amos Trust Just Walk pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which, unlike the Balfour celebrations which will be taking place in London that week, will give voice to what Balfour has felt like for those non-Jewish people living in the land. Being the wrong kind of Jew today means challenging and pushing against the acceptable parameters of debate within the formal Jewish community. It means articulating a path towards a new understanding of Jewish self-determination, which recognises that our freedom and security will always be linked to the freedom and security of all people. During 2015's visit to Britain by Benjamin Netanyahu, he was given a trip to the British Library to look at documents of special relevance to Jewish history, and you won't be surprised that the Balfour Declaration was one of them. But what if we could have shown the Prime Minister an updated version of Balfour? A version that took account of all that has happened in the last 100 years, a different 67 words, but closely based on the original. If you like, a rewrite by the wrong kind of Jews. So I thought I'd have a go. Okay, I've renamed it from the Balfour Declaration to the Boris Declaration. He was still the Foreign Secretary when I got here this morning. Whether he makes it till November, we'll have to see. But here it is. Her Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine, Israel, of a safe and secure home for all who live there. The nations of the world should use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil, political and religious rights of Jews or Palestinians living in Palestine, Israel or any other country. 67 new words that might just get us out of the trouble and pain that we have created in the last 100 years. Thank you very much.